Let me now introduce Cathy Woollums. Cathy is an attorney, and in her role as Senior Vice President and Chief Environmental Counsel at Berkshire Hathaway is responsible for the development and implementation of her company's worldwide corporate environmental policy, strategy, and programs. Cathy has served as an environmental policy witness in regulatory proceedings, seeking cost recovery of investments and emission controls, and has testified before the U.S. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee regarding cost of compliance with EPA regulations. Cathy has a tremendous amount of knowledge on the Clean Power Plan, and we're delighted to have her join us tonight as our keynote presenter. Please join me in welcoming Cathy.
Thanks, Temple, and thanks everyone for the warm welcome. To a certain extent, I feel like I come home to Wyoming, and maybe I'm sort of an unofficial or honorary citizen of the state. And I think, I've been here enough to know, for example, that where the Breadbasket Bakery is in Cheyenne, and have done a little bit of a tour around, probably spending more time in the state than I ever anticipated. But I'm based in Iowa, another small state, so I think that when we come from small states, we automatically feel a sort of kinship. And I think that's an important aspect in what we're going to talk about tonight, because we're all sort of in this together, and we'll see if we can come up with some creative solutions to one of the more pressing issues that the country is facing. Just a little bit, of course, about Berkshire Hathaway Energy. All our operating companies, as you see on the screen here, embody 6 core principles, and those are the foundation of our organizations, and revolving around customer service, employee commitment, environmental respect, which is the key aspect that I deal with in our organization, regulatory integrity, operational excellence, and financial strength. Just to give you an overview of kind of where we're coming from on this topic, because energy is a pretty wide open topic, really. When you think about it, we can think of human energy, we can think of various forms of energy. I'm in the energy specter, if you will, more in the world of electricity production, but Berkshire Hathaway Energy is a lot more than just electricity production. We've got a number of operating companies under our umbrella. We've got about 11.6 million customers worldwide. So we generate electricity, deliver it to end-use customers. We also have natural gas operations. And as you can see, we have a fairly large footprint in the West. We are the largest rate-regulated owner of renewable generation in the United States. But we're more than just renewables. We also generate electricity using coal, natural gas, nuclear, hydro, geothermal. If ever there was an all-above approach, I think we pretty much embody that. So from a fuels perspective, we're fairly agnostic. And when you go back to our core principles, our key driver is service to our customers, and we want to make sure that we can provide that service to our customers at the lowest possible cost while we're remaining in compliance with environmental requirements. Not an easy task necessarily on a day-to-day basis, but that's one of our fundamental principles that comes under the environmental respect umbrella is, we've got to do it in compliance. So we're coming at the Clean Power Plan not only from looking at it in terms of what it means, but how it is ultimately, if it makes it through the courts and has to be complied with, how is it that we're going to do that? And how do we position ourselves today to do that? Because we certainly don't want to wait until the last minute and find ourselves in a situation where we run out of options. We don't have the same number of options that we would have if we had started early. So I think when you look at the energy portfolio that we have and the number of renewables, we've already started to transition some of the electricity generation that we would need to accomplish under the Clean Power Plan. But stepping back a little bit further in terms of regulated entities, we do have an operating company, Pacific Corp, that operates in 6 western states under two umbrellas. One is Rocky Mountain Power, which serves parts of Wyoming as well as Utah and Idaho. And then we have Pacific Power that serves portions of California, Oregon, and Washington. It's probably an understatement to say that there is a wide diversity of opinion on a number of issues that are energy related between Oregon and Wyoming. So we'll talk about those a little bit further. We also, within the state of Wyoming, we take natural gas from the southeast part of the state through our Kern River Gas Transmission Company and bring it down through Utah, Nevada, into California. We've got a Midwestern utility where I live called Mid-American Energy. By the end of 2017, Mid-American Energy will be about 58% renewable generation. And I might add that was done all without substantial increases in customer rates. For 16 years, Mid-American Energy did not have an increase in its rates. So, there are ways that you can do things that might not have as dramatic a consequence if you can prepare for them. We've got in our gas transmission companies, about 16,400 miles of natural gas pipelines through our organization. We operate a transmission company in Canada called AltaLink, based in Alberta. We've got operations in the Philippines, the UK. We also have a regulated utility in Nevada, where there's a lot of controversy right now over rooftop solar, in case you haven't heard about that one. So fairly diverse organization. We also have operations in the UK, a electric distribution company, and we have a hydroelectric facility, 150 megawatt hydroelectric facility in the Philippines. Likewise, we, back about beginning of 2012, late 2011, established a company called BHE Renewables. And that's a non-regulated renewable organization that was designed to serve the renewables market in states where there are renewable portfolio standards. And they have the largest solar project in the world in California. Now, regardless of where you sit today in terms of your opinion and your perspectives, I think it's fair to say all of us have our own perspectives on carbon regulation. And those perspectives sometimes are very strong. We're going to see throughout this discussion, I think, today, that the perspectives can be informed by the public. And the picture on the left, yes, your left, was actually at the Paris, the COP21 Paris negotiations, where we have our daily protest of young people primarily, talking about things like climate justice and what does this mean for future generations, making sure that world leaders really paid attention to providing them a future, and a future that was lower in carbon. Our perspectives might be informed by the halls of Congress, or the US Supreme Court ultimately, or likewise by international negotiations, as you see in the bottom picture there. And we'll come back to this at the end. So why am I standing up here as a employee of an energy company talking to you about the Clean Power Plan? Why pick on electricity production? Or some people would say, why pick on coal? Why pick on natural gas? Why pick on anybody? Well, the electric power sector, of course, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. So, as the largest source, it was logical that we address the largest source first. So what lessons can we learn from addressing the largest source, and why, as we sit here today, why are we talking about the Clean Power Plan when really the story began a number of years ago in a case called Massachusetts versus EPA? And some of you may be familiar with that case, but it really provided the beginning of the carbon regulation path, because in that specific case, the US Supreme Court decided that the Environmental Protection Agency had existing authority under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. It didn't say you had to. It just said they had authority to do that, and based on EPA's authority, they could move forward to make a determination as to whether or not greenhouse gas regulation should occur. So what happened next was sort of an interesting response, because we had a number of bills there were hundreds of bills, literally, that were introduced in Congress to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Most of them were more directed to the economy-wide aspects, not just the electric power sector. But in 2009, then, we had what was called the Waxman-Markey bill. Some of you are familiar with that. It passed through the House of Representatives, but the Senate didn't pass that bill. And then all of a sudden, things kind of came to a halt in Congress. There was a lot of controversy over Waxman-Markey and who were winners and losers under that particular piece of legislation. But ultimately, it didn't go anywhere. So what happens next? We see the progression of greenhouse gas regulation by EPA first saying that now we're going to make you report greenhouse gas emissions, and not just informally, but on a more formal basis. You know, if you emit over a certain number of tons, you're going to have to start reporting. Of course, you know, we all know that what gets measured potentially gets regulated. So they started out with the reporting mechanism, and then shortly thereafter, the really linchpin, I think, was when EPA said, you know, under this cause and contribute endangerment finding, that greenhouse gases, in fact, endanger human health and the environment. So that was 2009. Kind of fast forward, we had the tailoring rule, which required people to get permits to emit greenhouse gases. And we went through a number of iterations in a number of states to make sure that rather than EPA having to issue those permits, that the states could issue those permits. From there, you know, things got a little bit more interesting because we were starting down, you know, headed down the regulatory path. We had permitting requirements, we had reporting requirements, and then President Obama kind of threw down the gauntlet to Congress and said, you know, if you're not going to regulate or legislate, I will. And ultimately he did. In June of 2013, the president announced his climate action plan and actually directed, through a 3-page memo, directed EPA to start to effectively regulate the electric sector for greenhouse gas emissions. So how did EPA do that? You know, Lord knows I'm not going to bore you with the intricacies of the Clean Air Act, because that's been my life for 25 years, and it's probably aged me more than that. But under the Clean Air Act, in order to regulate existing sources of greenhouse gas emissions, you know, once EPA went through the hurdles, once the Supreme Court said they could regulate it, and then they said it endangers human health and the environment, then they come up with, and there was a little litigation in between as well, but they came up with standards for new sources. So that's kind of the precursor to regulating existing sources, is regulating new sources. And so they issued a proposed regulation, got public comment on that. Ultimately, they reproposed that, got more public comment on it, and then in June of 2014, ultimately released a proposal under 111D, it's a particular section of the Clean Air Act, to regulate existing sources of emissions. And the Clean Power Plan then, what we reference as the Clean Power Plan, really was, when it came out in 2014, directed toward electric generating units and was designed to achieve a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions from 2005 levels. Now recognize the fact that 2005, in between that time, 2005 and 2014, we had a little thing called a recession, and we had some decline in greenhouse gas emissions nationwide anyway, because we had a lot of manufacturing industries that weren't running their full shifts. We had consumers that were very cost conscious, that were scaling back. We had new light bulbs going in. We had LEDs coming in. So some of the demand was down for electricity, but some other things were happening sort of behind the scenes. And some of you are familiar with natural gas drilling methodologies, and all of a sudden we had more availability of natural gas, and we had a dramatic decline in natural gas prices too. And so we saw economically some coal plants not generating as much because it was cheaper to use natural gas plants to generate electricity. So we were already kind of on our way of making some fairly significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but we had this proposal come up to further that reduction out to 2030. The program would have started in 2020, and it used sort of a formula to get there, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it really established state-by-state emission reduction requirements, and every state was different. And the theory was every state comes from a different perspective on this. They start at a different baseline, if you will. Some have more coal, some have more hydro, depending on what the state's generation mix was at the time. And so the regulation came out proposing for each state an emission level in terms of pounds per megawatt hour of electricity generated. Well, by the time the final rule came out, the timeline was pushed back a little bit, so we were going to start in 2022 instead of 2020, but the effective emission reduction became a little bit more stringent, and the reduction rate was going to be 32%. So there was definitely a trade-off there. And how did we get there? Well, the Clean Air Act requires that when EPA establishes one of these emission standards, that they utilize the best system of emission reduction. Unfortunately, they don't really define what that is. So the Clean Air Act doesn't define it. EPA fundamentally defined it by using what they call building blocks. And the initial proposal started out with 4 building blocks. The final proposal eliminated the last one, which was energy efficiency. And there are some that would submit that energy efficiency was the one that was probably on the least, what would I say, strong legal foot or standing, that it was most at risk from a legal perspective. But what EPA did in establishing ultimately the final emission reduction requirements was look at heat rate improvements in existing coal units. And I can tell you that it's, in terms of trying to create efficiencies in coal-fired units, there are a couple ways you can do it. One is by some operational controls, but that's a very minor portion. And then your operators can vary things, tweak things a little bit so the unit operates a little bit more efficiently. And I can tell you, our plant operators have tweaked the heck out of our units to make sure that they're operating as efficiently as they can, because you produce more megawatt hours with less fuel input, and it's a good thing because you get more output, right? Or the same output for fewer inputs. So it's always in our best interest. It's sort of like your automobile, if you step on the gas hard when you start up from a stop, that it's going to consume more energy than if you slow move your vehicle. Same kind of concept on coal units. But EPA nonetheless anticipated that we could achieve some fairly significant reductions in CO2 emissions by improving our heat rates. Second, they wanted to start to shift from coal to gas. And what they said was, we think there's a lot of natural gas combined cycle units around the country that are not being utilized fully. And that was true. But EPA said, we think you can increase the utilization, and we're going to sort of base our best system of emission reductions based on a greater utilization of those natural gas units. So if I've got a coal unit and I've got a gas unit and I've got this kind of requirement to meet an emission rate, I'm going to probably use my lower emitting unit to try to meet that rate. And that's kind of the concept that they were trying to advance under what's called Building Block 2, this redeployment or increased deployment of natural gas combined cycle units. And then lastly, and this was really the biggest element of the effort, was a dramatic increase in renewable generation around the country. And I'll come back to that issue because the assumptions there were pretty significant. And coming from a state that has a lot of renewable generation, as does Wyoming, you'll see that the assumptions here are pretty aggressive. Nonetheless, EPA did define the system very broadly and looked at the system as this sort of interconnected grid throughout the United States. It wasn't what Wyoming could do or what Iowa could do, it's what could be deployed across the country in the Western Interconnect, as you see on the left part of the screen there, the Eastern Interconnect, and then Texas, which is the ERCOT, which is sort of an island in and of itself. But they looked at those three regions as the interconnected grid and came up with these standards accordingly. I talked about that Building Block 2 renewable energy piece. And effectively what EPA did was say, notwithstanding the production tax credit and the various extensions, they looked at the maximum amount of renewables that had been deployed over the years and said, we can really do that each and every year. There's really no reason why we can't, right? And so you see a very aggressive build out of certainly wind and solar in the assumptions that ultimately lead to best system of emission reduction. And the theory, of course, is you build all these renewables and then you're backing down on your fossil fuel generation. So those are really the 4 building blocks, or 3 building blocks ultimately, as it turned out to be, that established the best system of emission reduction. But it really came up with a calculation, and what it resulted in is EPA saying, well, once we've run through this calculation, it's kind of simple math. We're going to give each state an emission rate to achieve, but it's going to be based on a natural gas emission rate of 771 pounds per megawatt hour and 1,305 pounds per megawatt hour for coal. And we're going to take your state's emission rates in 2012, and based on your percentage of coal and your percentage of gas, we multiply it by those 1301 and 771 numbers, and we come out with your emission rate that you've got to achieve. And oh, by the way, we'll also give you a cap in terms of total tonnage, and you can choose as a state whether you want to achieve the rate or the mass cap. So for Wyoming, between the proposed and the final rule, they came out with a 44% reduction from 2012 baseline in the emission rate. Iowa, my state, came out with a 42% reduction. Now, both states in the proposal had much lower reduction requirements, but it was the way EPA sort of recalculated things on a nationwide basis and applied those emission rates to the various states so that the bandwidth, the differences among states were much more narrow. And some states, like Washington, for example, or California, were able to actually increase their emissions rather than decrease them. That brings us to some of the key decisions that states have to make, assuming the Clean Power Plan moves forward. And I'll talk about the litigation in a minute. But how a state ultimately implements this Clean Power Plan is going to be critical for what its options are and potentially how much it's going to cost. But I talked about that you can meet either an emission rate or an emission cap. That's one of the key decisions that states will have to decide, which direction, which path they want to head down. And I'll tell you that what we're seeing is in states that have significant portfolios of fossil generation it's very difficult to add enough renewables and to basically come up with that average emission rate that's going to get them to the requirements that they have to meet. States can do it alone, or they can combine with other states and potentially trade emissions among states. But the state has to decide whether that's something they want to do or not do. If they go through a rate-based program, there's all sorts of monitoring and measurement and verification that has to be achieved. And remember that under a cap, you get something called emission allowances, and that's something that is potentially given to you, or it can be auctioned. So every entity would have to purchase these things to submit for compliance. But it's something that you already have. In a rate-based system, you have to generate credits, emission rate credits, to be able to achieve your emission rates. And that's something that you don't have. At the outset of the program, you wouldn't have that. You'd have to start to generate those before you'd know whether you'd have enough to potentially be in compliance. So fundamentally, there are trade-offs among the two programs. So just so Wyoming and Iowa don't feel alone, I wanted to give you a graphic of other states that are similarly situated in terms of the emission reduction requirements they have to achieve. So we do have Indiana, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Minnesota in that same general range of reduction requirements. So that is one graphic, but here's the other one, where you look at some of the other states that have a significantly lower hurdle to achieve in terms of what they need to get to, assuming again that the Clean Power Plan stays in place. So now, litigation. Litigation in the environmental context is almost inevitable. The fact is, I think there hasn't been a major Clean Air Act rule that's been proposed, at least that I'm aware of, over the last 10 years that hasn't been litigated. And believe me, this is the grandfather of all litigation, because there are more parties in this litigation. Literally, it will take up 50 pages of a brief just naming all the parties that are in the litigation. And they come from everywhere. It's states, it's utilities, it's consumer groups, it's plus 60 clubs, it's, you name it, everybody is litigating on one side or the other. And that litigation is based in the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And it was filed the same day. The first case actually was filed before the final rule came out, but it was filed literally the same day that the plan was published in the Federal Register. And briefing is going on right now. The most recent briefs were filed last Friday. So everybody's had a chance to file their initial briefs, both the petitioners and the respondents, and I spend my spare time, and when I'm trying to fall asleep at night, I'm reading briefs. But there is an accelerated schedule. Now, the parties to the litigation, at least the petitioners, asked the DC Circuit to stay the litigation, or to stay the implementation of the Clean Power Plan while the litigation was pending. And the DC Circuit declined to do that. Instead, what they asked is that, to establish an accelerated briefing schedule. So it is a pretty quick schedule. Oral argument will be heard before the DC Circuit in June. And then we'll see what happens in terms of timing of the decision. But rather than appeal the DC Circuit's denial of the stay, the parties went and appealed or filed a petition for stay to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this is sort of what I think of the Clean Power Plan at the moment. And you can look at it as sort of the ultimate roller coaster ride where you're missing a part of it, and you don't really know whether you're going to hit the mark or not. And, of course, in the midst of all of this, we did have one of the Supreme Court justices pass away, and I think one of his statements from a case is very telling in this case, which is administrative law is not for sissies. We all thought that litigation, and as a recovering litigator, I'll tell you, litigation is kind of fun, but administrative law takes more twists and turns, kind of like this roller coaster sometimes, than you could ever anticipate. So we did have the Supreme Court intervene, and actually, and in legal history, nobody's ever been able to find precedent for this, implemented a stay. And that stay of implementation of the Clean Power Plan lasts not just through the DC Circuit Court of Appeals and the outcome there, but all the way to the Supreme Court. So there's clearly an anticipation that somebody's going to appeal, the loser of this case is going to appeal to the Supreme Court. And it will stay in place until either the Supreme Court denies certiorari, so it doesn't take up the case, or it does, and it fully decides the case. Now, the complication, of course, is that the granting of that stay was on a 5-4 vote along party lines, and Justice Scalia voted to stay the implementation of the Clean Power Plan. But within days after, and hopefully it had nothing to do with it, but within days after, Justice Scalia passed away. And now there's only 8 justices on the Supreme Court, and if, for example, there are only 8 justices, although we know that another one has been appointed by the president, but may not be confirmed, if there are only 8 justices and the case is appealed and it's a 4-4 split, then whatever the DC Circuit decides stays. So there's a lot at stake in this DC litigation. So what do we expect from the DC litigation? I won't go into the details of Chevron deference, but needless to say, when an administrative agency who is supposed to have expertise over an issue like the Clean Air Act makes a decision in an area where there's no real precedent or the law is not necessarily clear, basically the courts tend to give that decision deference. But there's been some recent cases where that has not been the case, and the mercury and air toxics case is one of those where the Supreme Court came back and said, you didn't fully justify EPA, the costs of this regulation. You needed to do that up front, so therefore, go back and do your cost analysis. So the other dynamics at play, of course, are the Supreme Court justice and who ultimately gets to appoint that person and when that person is ultimately confirmed and what influence then it will have on an appeal. But likewise, the outcome of the November elections. So when you think about what's going to happen, we've got a court deciding this major rule. That court will potentially give deference to EPA, maybe not. It goes to the Supreme Court. There is a political element to the Supreme Court. And then we have an election where, timing-wise, when we think about that election, that's in November, and we don't know when the DC Circuit Court is going to decide the case, and it could be after November, could be before, we don't really know. So what's going to happen in the meantime while time marches on and courts make decisions and we've got this stay in place, because we've got this great degree of uncertainty at the moment. How do regulated entities like my organization move forward in the face of uncertainty where we want to make good decisions? We want to make sure that we're making decisions today that will prepare us for tomorrow or 3 years from now that are not going to unduly influence our customers' electric bills. Obviously, some states have put their pencils down and they're not working on their plans. It's about half and half. Some states are continuing to work, but we're all working, those who are working are saying, what are we working toward? We don't have a rule right now that we know definitively we need to work toward. And we've got some other aspects at play, which are things like the Paris Agreement. Temple talked about the last session in this series talking about the Paris Agreement. Well, the U.S. has already made this commitment of a 26 to 28% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2025, which doesn't necessarily square with the Clean Power Plan, but the Clean Power Plan was a critical piece of that. So April 22nd, the U.S. fully intends to move forward to signing the Paris Agreement. So again, let's go back to what do we do to make good decisions in the meantime, and how do we go through estate planning? I'm regulated. Chairman Muneer here is going to want to know how I'm going to keep my costs down and how I'm going to balance things with the Clean Power Plan. We do have things called integrated resource plans where we try to project out what the needs are going to be in terms of customer load, how we're going to meet those needs, what the regulatory requirements are. So we're going to have to think long and hard about this, about what is put into those plans and how we're going to prepare for the future. We are seeing a resurgence of state energy plans. And those state plans are things like, where energy offices didn't necessarily take a front row seat on some of the planning aspects. We are seeing some states kind of reinstitute some of those agencies to take a more active role in energy planning. We did sort of get this little Christmas gift at the end of last year, which was the extension of the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, which will help continue renewables build out. And of course, we have the Paris Agreement. So what do? Do we take a no regrets perspective? One element of that that we've seen recently is this Governor's Accord for a New Energy Future, where a number of governors around the country basically said, notwithstanding Clean Power Plan, we think it's a good idea to continue to diversify our generation portfolios, expand clean energy sources, prepare the grid for more renewables, and prepare us generally for the future of electricity. So I'm going to end here where I started, about perspectives on this issue, and I'm sure that you all have a number of perspectives that may or may not have been informed by the conversation today, but I know that there's a great deal of passion about this issue, and that oftentimes informs our perspectives as well. So with that, I think that's a segue into our panel.
Great, thank you, Cathy. Very helpful information.